The millionaire's disabled daughter drowned in the pool, and only the cleaning lady's black son jumped in to save her. But what happened after his heroic act changed everything forever. Tiago Santos' dive into the crystal-clear pool at the Whitmore mansion echoed like a gunshot in the tense silence of that Saturday afternoon. As 40 elite guests watched in shock, the 17-year-old cut through the water with desperate determination toward Isabella's lifeless body, which was slowly sinking in her water chair. "Someone has to do something," one of the ladies had shouted, but her designer shoes remained firmly planted on the Italian marble surrounding the pool. Tiago didn't think twice. The son of Donna Carmen, the cleaning lady who had cleaned that house for 12 years, he knew every corner of that property and knew that Isabella, at 15, had cerebral palsy and couldn't save herself. Her adapted equipment had failed, and panic had taken over her face as she struggled against the water. In a few seconds that seemed like an eternity, Tiago reached the girl, freed her from the submerged chair, and brought her to the surface. Her breathing returned in desperate gasps as he carried her to the edge, where hands finally reached out to help. "Thank you," Isabella whispered between coughs, clinging to her savior's arm with genuine gratitude. That was when Richard Whitmore appeared, pushing the crowd of guests aside. His face was red with anger, but not because of the situation that had almost cost his daughter her life. "What the hell are you doing in the social area?" he roared at Tiago, who was still dripping water by the pool. "Didn't your mother teach you to stay in your place?" The young man stared at the millionaire with disconcerting calm. At 17, Tiago had already learned that men like Richard Whitmore saw people like him only as threats to their perfect world, even when they saved lives. "Dad, he saved me," Isabella tried to intervene, but was quickly silenced. "Shut up, Isabella. You shouldn't be using that defective equipment," Richard turned to Tiago again. "And you, kid, you'll regret setting foot where you weren't invited." As Tiago watched the scene unfold, something in his eyes revealed that this was not just another teenager scared of authority. There was a serenity there that only exists in those who have faced much worse storms and knew exactly how to survive them. If this story of prejudice and injustice touched you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because what happened next proved that underestimating someone's intelligence can be the biggest mistake of your life. In the 48 hours following the rescue, the Whitmore mansion turned into a veritable social battlefield. Richard had fired Donna Carmen that same day, claiming breach of security protocol for allowing his son to frequent restricted areas. The irony was delicious, punishing the mother of the hero who saved his own daughter. "You have 24 hours to leave the staff quarters," Richard had declared to Carmen on the phone, his voice as cold as ice in January. "And don't let that brat set foot on this property again. I'm being generous not to sue you for trespassing." Isabella had tried to intercede on her friend's behalf, but each attempt resulted in her father increasing the punishments. First, he confiscated her phone. Then he forbade her from taking her adapted swimming lessons, the very activity that gave her the most independence. Finally, he hired a private nurse to watch her 24 hours a day, turning her own home into a gilded prison. "You don't understand, sweetheart," Richard explained with that fake patience that rich people use when they want to seem reasonable. "People like them create emotional bonds to take advantage of us. That boy saved you for the reward, not out of kindness." But Isabella had known Tiago for years. She remembered the afternoons when he helped her with her homework while her mother was working, the books he borrowed from the public library for them to read together, the jokes he told to make her laugh on difficult days of physical therapy. Richard would never understand that there are people in the world motivated by something other than money. Meanwhile, in the modest rented house where they now lived, Tiago displayed a serenity that would intrigue any psychologist. At 17, he had developed an impressive ability to turn every injustice into fuel for something greater. "Mom, don't worry," he said, calmly organizing his school books on the kitchen table. "We'll be fine." Carmen watched her son with a mixture of pride and concern. Since he was little, Tiago had been different. When other children cried for expensive toys, he took apart broken electronic devices to understand how they worked. When classmates complained about difficult teachers, he borrowed books to study beyond the curriculum. And when he faced racism at school, he responded by getting the best grades in his class. "Son, I know you're smart, but Richard Whitmore has power and money. Men like that destroy lives on a whim," Carmen warned, her hands still shaking from the humiliation of being escorted out of the mansion by security guards. Tiago smiled, not the bitter smile of someone who accepts defeat, but something much more dangerous. It was the smile of someone who had just received exactly the motivation he needed. "Mom, Do you remember the story you always told me about Grandpa? How he built our first house brick by brick, even when everyone said a black man would never own property in this neighborhood. Carmen nodded, not understanding where her son was going with this. He didn't build that house to prove he was right. He built it to prove they were wrong. Tiago opened his laptop, an old model he had repaired himself, and began to type. Richard Whitmore thinks he knows me. He thinks I'm just another scared kid from the projects. On the screen, a web page began to take shape. Tiago had taught himself to program at 13, after getting a broken computer from a junkyard. His fingers flew over the keyboard with the precision of a pianist performing a symphony. What are you doing? Asked Carmen. Research. The answer was simple, but there was something in Tiago's tone that made his mother realize she was witnessing the birth of something much bigger than a simple teenage reaction. Over the next few days, while Richard celebrated his victory against the Santos family, Tiago immersed himself in a universe of public information. Business records, political donations, court cases, government contracts. It was all there, waiting for someone smart enough to connect the dots. And Tiago Santos, son of a cleaning lady, fatherless, living on the outskirts of town, was about to teach the powerful Richard Whitmore a lesson he would never forget. Never underestimate the intelligence of someone who has everything to gain and nothing to lose. Each new discovery made his eyes shine with an intensity that his mother recognized, but which also frightened her. It was the same gleam he had when he took apart electronic devices, the pure joy of someone who had just figured out exactly how the pieces fit together. A week after his humiliating dismissal, Tiago had turned the kitchen table into a veritable operations center. 3 old laptops he had picked up at a junkyard were running simultaneously, their screens glowing in the early morning hours as he navigated public databases, business records, and social networks with the precision of a seasoned detective. Son, it's 3 in the morning, Carmen murmured, appearing in the kitchen in her robe. You need to sleep. 15 more minutes, Mom, Tiago replied without looking up from the screens. I'm almost done with an important part. What Carmen didn't know was that her son had discovered something fascinating about Richard Whitmore. The man who presented himself as an upstanding real estate mogul had a history of hushed labor lawsuits, suspicious government contracts, and a network of shell companies that would make any federal prosecutor salivate with interest. At school, Tiago found the perfect ally in a person no one would expect, Professor Janet Morrison, a former investigative journalist who had become an educator after exposing a political scandal that nearly cost her her career. She noticed when Tiago began asking sophisticated questions about corporate law and journalistic ethics during class. You're investigating someone, aren't you? She asked after class, her experience recognizing the signs immediately. Tiago hesitated, but something in the teacher's demeanor made him trust her. Yes, ma'am. The man who fired my mother unfairly. Janet smiled, not with pity, but with professional respect. Show me what you've got. When Tiago presented his preliminary findings, Janet was impressed. In 1 week, the young man had compiled information that would take an experienced journalist months to gather. You have a natural talent for this, she admitted. But you need legal guidance so you don't make mistakes that could hurt the case. Meanwhile, Richard Whitmore continued his campaign of cruelty with the arrogance typical of someone who had never faced real consequences. He had hired a security firm to monitor the Santos family, convinced that they would try to get revenge in some primitive way. People like them are predictable, he commented on the phone to his lawyer. They'll probably try to sue for wrongful dismissal or create some kind of scandal on social media. Nothing that a few $1,000s in legal fees won't solve. What Richard didn't know was that his own security cameras had captured his most incriminating conversations. Tiago had discovered that the mansion surveillance system had a glaring vulnerability. Richard himself had insisted on having remote access via his cell phone, creating a loophole that a skilled programmer could exploit. Isabella, confined to her gilded prison, found an ingenious way to communicate with the outside world. Her nurse, a compassionate woman named Rosa, couldn't ignore the glaring injustice of the situation and secretly allowed the girl to use her personal phone. I need to talk to Tiago, Isabella had begged. Just 5 minutes. Please. When they finally got to talk, Isabella provided crucial information that even Tiago's online investigations had failed to uncover. My father has a secret office in the basement, she whispered into the phone. I hear him talking there every night with people I've never seen. And there's a safe behind my grandfather's picture. Tiago absorbed every detail, his strategic mind connecting this information with everything he had already discovered. The puzzle was coming together, and the final picture would be devastating for Richard Whitmore. Professor Janet had introduced Tiago to Marcus Chun, a civil rights lawyer who worked pro bono on cases of social injustice. Marcus was intrigued not only by the evidence the young man had compiled, but by the sophistication of his approach. "You're 17 years old and you're already putting together better cases than some lawyers," Marcus observed during their first meeting. "But we need to be careful. Men like Whitmore have the resources to destroy entire lives if they feel threatened." "Professor Chun," Tiago replied with that disconcerting serenity his mother recognized, "they can only destroy what you allow them to see. And I've been very careful about what I let them see." Over the next 2 weeks, while Richard celebrated his supposed victory over the troubled family, Tiago worked 18 hours a day refining his plan. Every insult, every display of arrogance, every act of cruelty Richard committed was carefully documented and filed away. Carmen watched her son's transformation with a mixture of pride and concern. The boy who had always been mature for his age now displayed a strategic depth that was almost frightening. His sleepless nights were spent not on games or social media, but on building something she didn't yet fully understand. "Mom," Tiago said one morning, closing the last laptop and stretching after another early morning of work. "You know that story about Grandpa building our first house brick by brick?" "Of course, son." "He didn't just prove he was right. He built something that lasted for generations." Tiago smiled, and for the first time in weeks, Carmen recognized her son's genuine smile. "Richard Whitmore thinks he knows me. He thinks I'm just another angry young man who will give up when the anger passes." Carmen felt a chill run down her spine, not from fear, but from anticipation. "What he doesn't know is that I'm not just building revenge. I'm building a legacy." Tiago opened a folder on his computer, revealing months of meticulous work. "And when I'm done, the whole town will know exactly who Richard Whitmore is." At that moment, with the morning light illuminating her son's determined face, Carmen realized she was witnessing something extraordinary. Beneath Richard Whitmore's cruel arrogance, an unstoppable force had been born, fueled not by anger, but by a relentless pursuit of justice that would forever change the lives of everyone involved. Monday morning began like any other for Richard Whitmore, until his phone exploded with 53 missed calls before 8 o'clock. His secretary was hysterical, reporters surrounded the Whitmore Holdings building, and his wife had locked the doors to their mansion, refusing to speak to anyone. "What the hell is going on?" Richard roared at his lawyer Harrison Wells, who appeared in his office with a face as pale as a sheet. "Richard, we need to talk. Now." Wells closed the door and activated the soundproofing, a protocol reserved only for the most devastating crises. "Someone leaked everything. And when I say everything, I mean absolutely everything." On the computer screen, Wells opened dozens of web pages simultaneously. The Herald Tribune read, "Real estate magnate used shell companies to launder money." The Financial Times had published, "Fraudulent government contracts yielded millions to Whitmore." But it was the Washington Post headline that made Richard slump in his chair. "Secret recordings reveal plans to eliminate witnesses." "That's impossible," Richard whispered, his hands shaking as he scrolled through the articles. "No one had access to that information. My office is bugged, my phones are encrypted, Richard," Wells interrupted, pointing to a specific section of an article. "They don't just have documents. They have audio recordings of your conversations in your secret basement office. Conversations where you discuss in detail how to solve the Santos problem, after they get involved where they shouldn't." Richard's blood ran cold. Those conversations had taken place in his most private sanctuary, the office that not even his wife knew existed. Who could have done this? The answer came in the form of an email addressed exclusively to Richard, sent from an address he recognized immediately, investigakeo@whitmore@gmail.com. The sender had signed simply T.S. Mr. Whitmore. "Over the past 6 weeks, I have systematically documented your criminal activities through public sources, recordings obtained legally via security breaches in your own systems, and testimony from people you have severely underestimated. Your shell companies, documented. Your fraudulent contracts, exposed. Your threats against my family, recorded. Your deliberate negligence toward Isabella, filmed. You said people like me are predictable. You were right, I predicted exactly how you would react when your arrogance was exposed publicly. The difference between us is simple: you use your power to destroy innocent lives. I use my intelligence to protect those I love and expose those who harm others. P.S. The federal authorities have already received copies of everything. Your accounts were frozen 20 minutes ago. Sincerely, Tiago Santos, the boy you underestimated. Richard read the email 3 times, his mind refusing to process the reality. A 17-year-old teenager had destroyed an empire built over decades. This can't be happening, he muttered, his hands sweating as he tried to access his online bank accounts. Access denied. All of them. Richard, there's more, Wells said, his voice barely audible. They have a video of you threatening the Santos family on the day you fired them. Someone hid a camera in your office during the conversation. In fact, there was no hidden camera. Isabella, using Rosa's phone, had recorded the entire conversation through an open call that Tiago had secretly received. But Richard didn't need to know those technical details. Richard's phone rang. It was the FBI. Mr. Whitmore, this is Special Agent Victoria Torres. We have a search and seizure warrant for your properties and offices. We request your immediate presence at our office to clarify the charges of money laundering, tax fraud, and witness intimidation. As Richard tried to formulate a response, Wells whispered urgently, "They're already at the mansion. Isabella is being interviewed by social services about parental neglect and a toxic home environment." The irony was delicious. Richard had spent weeks boasting about how he had put that family in its place, never imagining that every act of cruelty was being meticulously documented and turned into evidence against him. Across town, Tiago watched the news in the small apartment he now shared with his mother. Carmen was in tears, not from sadness, but from overwhelming pride in the son who had turned a brutal injustice into a lesson in dignity and intelligence. "Son, how did you pull this off?" she asked, still in disbelief. "Mom, you taught me that education is the one thing no one can take away from you." Richard Whitmore forgot that intelligence has no color, social class, or address. He underestimated me because he saw only a black kid from the projects. He didn't see a self-taught programmer, a natural strategist, someone who has learned to turn every obstacle into fuel for something greater. Professor Janet called, ecstatic. "Tiago, 3 universities have already called offering full scholarships after they heard about your investigative work. Harvard, MIT, and Stanford want to talk to you this week." Marcus Chun, the lawyer, showed up an hour later with official documents. "Isabella's family has filed a request for you to be named her educational guardian while she is under state protection. She specifically asked to continue studying with you." At that moment, as sirens echoed through the city toward Whitmore's properties, Tiago smiled with the serenity of someone who had proven a fundamental point. True strength does not come from money or inherited power, but from the ability to transform injustice into opportunity, humiliation into fuel, and contempt into absolute determination. Richard Whitmore had tried to destroy a family out of pure prejudice and arrogance. In response, he received a masterclass on how intelligence, when combined with righteous purpose, can bring down entire empires built on rotten foundations. The real estate mogul who had woken up that morning believing he controlled destinies now faced the reality that his own destiny had been sealed by a young man he had dismissed as just another troubled kid. The crucial difference was that Tiago Santos had never underestimated anyone, especially not the destructive power of blind arrogance in men who confuse privilege with superiority. 6 months after Richard Whitmore's spectacular fall, the transformation in Tiago Santos' life seemed like something out of a movie, but it was absolutely real. The young man who had been humiliated and expelled from a mansion now walked the halls of Harvard University with a full scholarship in computer science and digital law, a double degree created especially for him after 3 universities competed for his enrollment. "Mom, look at this," said Tiago, showing his cell phone to Carmen as they had lunch in the university cafeteria. The Boston Herald headline read, "Former tycoon Richard Whitmore sentenced to 15 years in prison for money laundering and witness intimidation." Carmen smiled, but her pride went far beyond the downfall of the man who had tried to destroy her family. "Son, do you remember when you were 8 years old and took apart that old radio I brought home from work?" "Sure. You got mad because you thought I broke it. I was angry because I didn't understand that you were trying to understand how things worked inside. Today I realize that I always knew you saw what others couldn't see." Tiago's story had become a national phenomenon. 3 documentaries, dozens of interviews, and a book in development told how a teenager from the slums had brought down an empire built on prejudice and corruption using only intelligence, determination, and an internet connection. Universities began teaching the Santos case in ethics, investigative journalism, and social justice classes. Isabella, now under the guardianship of a carefully selected adoptive family, continued her study sessions with Tiago via video chat. At 16, she had become an eloquent activist for the rights of people with disabilities, using her own experience to expose how prejudice can exist even within the most privileged families. Tiago taught me that being underestimated can be our greatest advantage, she said during a speech at her school. While people are busy putting you down, you can be building something they never expected. On the other side of the country, Richard Whitmore was serving his sentence at the federal penitentiary in Danbury. His bank accounts were confiscated, his mansions auctioned off to pay damages, and his reputation completely destroyed. Former elite friends avoided mentioning his name, and his own wife had divorced him before the trial was even over, claiming she had been misled for years about the character of the man she married. In a letter that was never sent, found by guards during a routine search, Richard had written, "I completely underestimated that boy. I thought that power and money were enough to crush anyone who dared to challenge me. I never imagined that he had the intelligence and patience to build my own destruction brick by brick, using my arrogance as fuel." The irony was perfect. The man who had spent his life belittling people for their color or social class now shared a cell with exactly the kind of people he had always despised. And unlike him, they treated him with the basic human dignity he had never offered anyone. Marcus Chun, the lawyer who had mentored Tiago, now ran the Santos Chun Institute for Digital Justice, funded by donations that poured in from across the country after the story went viral. Tiago proved that in today's digital world, the truth can travel faster than lies, and justice can be more effective than revenge, Chun explained in interviews. Professor Janet Morrison, who had been the first to recognize Tiago's investigative potential, now taught a course called Citizen Journalism and Social Responsibility at the same school where it had all begun. "My students learn that each of us can be an agent of change," she said proudly. Tiago proved that age, background, or financial resources do not determine your ability to make a difference. 3 years later, during his magna cum laude graduation from Harvard, Tiago was invited to be the class speaker. In front of thousands of people, including his mother in the front row, he shared the lesson he had learned on that fateful day at the Whitmore's pool. "When Richard Whitmore looked at me with contempt and told me I didn't know my place, he was right in a way he never imagined. I didn't really know my place, because my place wasn't determined by the address where I was born, the color of my skin, or my mother's profession. My place was determined by my ability to turn injustice into fuel for something greater. True revenge isn't destroying those who hurt you. It's building something so extraordinary that they realize they wasted an opportunity to have you on their side. It's proving that your greatness never depended on their approval." The audience rose to a standing ovation that lasted a full 5 minutes. Among those present were dozens of young people from humble backgrounds who had been inspired by Tiago's story to pursue their own impossible dreams. Carmen, at 62, now ran her own cleaning company, employing other women from the community with fair wages and full benefits. "My son taught me that we should never accept what others say we are," she said. "We are the ones who decide that." The story that began with a heroic dive into a swimming pool had turned into waves of change that swept across the country. Schools began teaching about unconscious bias, companies revised their hiring policies, and thousands of young people discovered they had the power to challenge unjust systems. Richard Whitmore had tried to teach Tiago Santos his place in society. In response, Tiago had taught the whole world that no place is too small for someone with enough greatness to turn injustice into opportunity. The final lesson was crystal clear: arrogance destroys those who practice it, but intelligence combined with a just purpose builds legacies that last for generations. Tiago had not only defeated Richard Whitmore, he had proven that true power never lies in bank accounts or property titles, but in the ability to see potential where others see only prejudice. And if you also believe that the best revenge is the success your enemies could never imagine, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories that prove that justice, when served with intelligence, always finds its way.